Keep on the sunny side, always on the sunny side. Keep on the sunny side of life. It will help us every day, it will brighten all the way. If you keep on the sunny side of life.
Rushing wind blow through this temple, blowing out the dust within. Come and breathe your breath upon me, 'cause I've been born again. Oh Jesus, you're the one who set my spirit free. Oh, use me, Lord, glorify your holy name through me. You know, that's a great prayer. In these times especially, you can see my breath, it's a little bit, my stove's just kind of starting to get going. I want to thank you for taking a few moments to look at this video. My name is Joe Martin. I'm the pastor at First Baptist Church in Toledo, Washington. I've been here for 40 years, just a few miles from beautiful Mount St. Helens. And I get to work with great people and people that have been tested pretty hard in this pandemic and with all the upheaval that we've seen. Recently I had, I'm going to grab my cup of tea here. Recently I had a good friend of mine got me thinking. He asked me a few questions, and he was asking me about how do we think about things in the midst of all this turmoil. You know, times of turmoil create a lot of confusion for people, and I think back on my experience as a pastor in this place, Y2K, and the 2008 financial crisis. Really, I think those were kind of like remedial courses compared to what we've been through. But the question really came up and the thought came up, which is during these times of disruption and political disappointment, one of the things that always seems to happen is these end time speculations arise. People begin to wonder. And oftentimes self-appointed end times prophets, and oftentimes they're sincere people, but not informed well, not led well by God. Other times they're grifters that see easily deceived people that can become fanatics to their cause. They rise up too. This happened in both of those cases in my experience as a pastor. And you know, even Jesus warned about this happening. He talked about the fact that a lot of times people that are always talking about signs are in fact signs in themselves of the times. Jesus said, you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. This is out of Matthew 24, and you should read the whole context. There's a lot there. But that whole passage is really talking about it goes on later on in chapter 24, many false prophets will arise and mislead many. And this is especially true when it comes to the eschaton, the end times. You know, just about the time we forget the lessons of the last misguided preachers or authors or sometimes religious scammers, a new crisis will arise up, bring a fresh crop of people who are open, easily deceived. They can bring new opportunities for the devil to bring division and oftentimes disappointment in the life of God's people. This has happened over and over again And sometimes even myself, I can forget how things have played out. But one of the things the Bible warns us about is this: not to be overly certain of our own assumptions. This is really important. As a matter of fact, what I want to talk to you about today is really going down by doubling down. Oftentimes we go to the darkest places in our lives, and as we respond especially to really difficult experiences and disappointing experiences, we fall in love with our own ideas and our own assumptions. And the Bible warns us about it. Proverbs 14:12 says, there is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Proverbs 14:15 says, the knave believes everything, but the sensible man considers his steps. He's not saying don't believe anything. He's saying your belief needs to be really thought out. It needs to be well-founded and not just fueled by the middle of the circumstances that you're in. Proverbs 14:16 goes on to say, a wise man is cautious and turns away from evil, but a fool is arrogant and careless. In other words, we need to be careful. We need to be discerning. Even the book of 1 John says many false prophets test the spirits, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. You know, long before many of the modern TV and YouTube imitators and some of the really destructive false teachers like Jim Jones, those of you that maybe don't remember, not so many years ago, he was started out as a kind of a fairly middle-of-the-road preacher in the San Francisco area, and then he became more and more radical and more into the second coming, and he got all his people to move to Guyana, and then he had a TV ministry, and then as it became clear to his followers that he was a fraud and that it was falling apart, those followers, rather than accepting their leader was a fraud, killed themselves. Over 900 of them. That's where the term drinking the Kool-Aid came from. And not only did they kill themselves, but they killed other people that didn't want to go that way, including a congressional delegation. There have been other notable characters in recent times of stress. Harold Campy, if you remember, not too many years ago, he took spent millions and millions of dollars on billboards and trucks about the fact that Jesus was coming on a specific date and time, and he was quite popular on a radio show called Family Radio, and many people went for that. And even lately, a lot of prophecies from people that have been fairly well known, like Pat Robertson and others, there are always new ones. And a multitude of others that are going on right now, other Johnny-come-latelys who link American politics and current events or something that's happening in the newspaper. They all prove that really there's nothing new under the American sun or in the American religious corporate economy. Long before these people came along, though, there is another American story about a man named William Miller, and most people have forgotten him. It happened just before the Civil War. He had been a veteran and probably may have been impacted because he was nearly killed, and some of his men were. In the War of 1812, he was a captain. And when he came back from the war, he had married and settled down in New York. He made steps to kind of come back to his Baptist faith. At first, he had been a deist for a while, but then he rejected that. He soon became, was very studious and careful. He did many things. He had been in law enforcement. He had been a policeman or a sheriff, justice of the peace. He was also a farmer, but most people were in some way in those days. He filled in as a Baptist lay preacher, and he began to search the scriptures for the truth. And after 2 years, he became convinced in his reading, though he didn't know the languages and he didn't know much about history. He really hadn't been trained at all, just kind of self-taught. He came to the conviction that in Daniel 8:14, he came to a insight, he thought, Under 2,300 days then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. The cleansing of the sanctuary, which was his idea about it, was a reference to Christ, was actually a misunderstanding of the Hebrew word about cleanse, which is a whole other issue. But Miller believed that could only mean the purging of the earth by fire and, in short, the end of the world. And of course, you have to remember the French Revolution was going on. We just had a revolution in our country. There was a battle over slavery rising and over white supremacy. There was incredible pressures. Shortly after he began to come to these understandings, there was different things that happened in the heavens, meteorite shower, Halley's Comet. All of this formed a kind of cultural just pressure chamber for this to take off. And he interpreted these prophetic days as years, and the date of the prophecy he placed from his studies that Miller concluded that the end of the world, the 2,300 days, would happen in the fall of 1843. Initially, it could be the spring of 1843, sometime between the spring of 1843 and the spring of 1844. He said, was thus brought to the solemn conclusion that in about 25 years from the time of these affairs, our present state would be wound up. And he kept it to himself for a while, but then he began to share his ideas locally. And then, as always happens, oftentimes with religion, go big or go home. People think that if something is popular, it must be true. He began to share his ideas, and then he began to go around and teach some of these ideas, kind of the early version of the prophecy seminar. And he ran into this big-time Baptist pastor from Boston, and it was the early social media. They had printing, and William Miller had done a little bit of printing, but he ran into this guy named Joshua V. Himes. He was the pastor of a church in Boston. And after he printed a book about this in 1838, about the second coming of Christ in 1843, he made these excursions. He met this man, and Himes decided he was going to be his promoter and his agent. He publicized and he sent people out and got other people, and he equipped Miller with a great chart displaying the millennial calculations in the graphic form, and you may have seen some of these. I think somebody gave me one. I got it on my wall someplace. He purchased the biggest tent in the country for his meetings. It was giant. And he added 2 journals, the New York's Midnight Cry and Boston's Signs of the Times. That word's been used a few times. Now, Miller was transformed overnight into the Millerite movement. It became more than just about him. He wasn't just a popular preacher. It became a thing. In our terms, we would say he went viral. Himes and his associates recruited other evangelists and sent them on tours, and they organized camp meetings, and they published tracts and books and pamphlets. This went everywhere. And as the dreaded year approached, Miller's preaching drew larger crowds. In 6 months, he delivered more than 300 messages, 300 lectures, with the constant theme, are you ready to meet your Savior? They say that somewhere between 50,000 and 500,000 were ardent believers. That seems like a pretty broad spread, but I was trying to take all my sources. And as many as 1 million other people were curious and expectant. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot nowadays, but you have to remember the population of the early United States was very small in those days. So it was a significant number. He was a phenomenon. But in January 1843, he announced that this Hebrew year, March 21st, 1843 to March 21, 1844, must see the end of time. This is it. But he pleaded, if the estimates should prove slightly inaccurate, his followers should have faith and the deliverance would eventually come. And then in March 21st, then they waited. They waited and they waited. In March 21st, 1843, nothing happened. And then March 21st, 1844 came and nothing happened. After a month, Miller, because you have to remember, he was a sincere guy. He really was honest. He confessed his error and acknowledged his disappointment. But this is where doubling down comes in. Even though he recognized it. When Jesus did not return in March 21st, 1843, or March 21st, 1844, he, after the first date, people just doubled down and went along with it. But after the second date, people still doubled down because he had a follower. Oftentimes, the person that comes after you is even more zealous. One of his followers pointed to a verse in Habakkuk in Leviticus and explained there must be a tarrying time of 7 months and 10 days. And so they kicked it out 7 months. So on October 22nd, 1844, became a new day of Christ's return. The people were rallied again with the slogan, the 10th day of the 7th month, and Miller was finally converted to the new date. Miller went along too. He was caught up in his own movement. He said, well, maybe it's not all for nothing. He said, thank the Lord, O my soul, I am almost home. The excitement revived, the numbers of thousands and thousands of people living on the edge of eternity seemed to be greater than ever. And when the second date came and went, just as the first one, and the third date came and went, just like the second one, the followers were completely disillusioned. Can you imagine? When you're told stuff, when you're lied to, when you're deceived. Sometimes you're deceived, and sometimes you're deceived by people who are deceived. You don't know. But they were completely disillusioned. They became bitter toward Miller. And he lived until 1849, and then he died discredited and almost forgotten. But it's important to back up a little bit and realize that when Jesus didn't come back on October 22nd, 1844, devastation came out of that. It happened to the masses. It was so traumatic that the loss of faith was so dramatic in the lives of believers that it is called to this day the great disappointment in American religious history. Now, you may not read a lot of American religious history, but I do. October 22nd passed without incident. This is somebody writing out of his journal in that time. October 22nd passed without incident, resulting in feelings of disappointment among many Millerites. Henry Emmons, a Millerite, later wrote, I waited all Tuesday, October 22nd, and dear Jesus did not come. I waited all the forenoon of Wednesday and was well in body as I ever was, but at 12 o'clock I began to feel faint. And before dark, I needed someone to help me up to my chamber. As my natural strength was leaving me very fast, I lay prostrate for 2 days without any pain, sick with disappointment. Boy, we've seen some disappointments. People pulled into things and hoping for things and told things, and then they're all disappointed no matter what. And we know that hope deferred makes the heart grow sick. But the problem is that we have to be careful to not overestimate our ability to be certain about everything. There's a few things we can be certain about. There's a lot of things that we can't be. As a matter of fact, the Bible says no one knows the day or the hour. And we can't be certain about a lot of things, and probably don't need to double down on those kind of issues. You know, Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to counsel. That's pretty important. William Miller could have probably been helped a lot if he would have actually sought out the counsel of people who actually knew some history around the book of Daniel. And they knew about the intertestamental period and how to read some Greek, but he didn't do that. 1 Corinthians 3:18, Paul said it like this, let no man deceive himself. Boy, we can do it. I know I can. I know you probably can too. If any man among you thinks that he is wise in this age, that means you've got it figured out. He must become foolish so that he may become wise. That's an amazing verse, especially in its context. Paul knew what it was like to have zeal without knowledge. You remember, he was a guy who was so sure about his religious position and his position as within the nation of Israel, his cultural position and his political position in relationship to Rome, that he was sure of himself, and he suffered the consequences. He was a persecutor of the church. I just want to say to you, if you want to avoid the downfall of the double down tendency in your life, there's 2 or 3 things I would just tell you. Number 1, maintain the humility to consider you can be wrong and admit when it's clear you are. These can be good lessons, and you should be very careful to not isolate yourself from people that could tell you different. If you only end up in your own echo chamber, your chances of doubling down will be much, much more likely and more dangerous. And then secondly, that brings me to this. Get good counsel. Remember, the wise person gets good counsel, gets a lot of sources, looks around, asks people that they felt like they can trust. Even people that they know maybe have a different perspective. And then thirdly, keep the main thing the main thing. You know what happened to the Millerites and most other people that get pulled into, whether it's a religious cult or a political cult or movement? You know what? We lose sight of the main thing. If you're a Christian, if you call yourself a Christian, there is a main thing. 1 Corinthians 8:2 says, if anyone supposes that he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him. That's the main thing. That you love God. You love Christ. And because of that, you are known by him. Loving Jesus is the main thing. And loving Jesus means I'm going to love you because I love Jesus, even if I don't fully get you. And loving Jesus is the main thing. Loving Jesus is the key to obedience. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. If you love me, you'll love those around you. You know, the majority of tens of thousands of Christians are affected oftentimes by the fact that we get pulled into doubling down. Maybe your kids or your family members, your witness for sure. Because if you do not take these steps, or like I said, maintain humility to consider that you could be wrong and admit it when it's clear, and to get good counsel and to keep the main thing the main thing. If you don't do this, you can bring great damage to yourself and to the gospel. And a lot of that's been happening. The majority of tens of thousands of people that came out of the Millerite movement abandoned Christianity, never went back to church. They were so disillusioned and felt like they'd been deceived and duped and scammed. A lot of them gave away a lot of money. A lot of them paid for a lot of these ministries. A lot of them didn't harvest their crops because they thought the Lord was coming back in October. A few people drifted back to churches, though much of the benefits of the Second Great Awakening were lost because of this disillusionment, the great disappointment. And then small numbers doubled down even further. And there's always going to be a fringe that are going to double down even after the doubling down didn't work. And they formed other smaller groups that later became known as one version of an Adventist group or the other, the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Shakers. You know, after Miller's third failure, a few of his followers remained. That's the amazing thing. You know, the most amazing thing is not about the Miller phenomenon, but it's so many people that believed him in the first place for so long. They stuck with him for so long. Perhaps followers found themselves too far out on a particular limb. You can too. You can find yourself that you ventured out so far, you made claims that are so far you can't back down. You see, Among them was that farmer from Rutland whose figurative limb was a literal barn roof. I'm reading this out of a history book. His fall broke his leg, but not his spirit, and he later became a deacon in the local church. The man had given up on Miller, but not on Jesus. You know what we need to do? It's okay to give up on some things when you see you're wrong. I've been passionately wrong about quite a few things in my life. I want to encourage you. Don't be wrong about this. Don't be wrong about Jesus. He's the one that matters. God bless you. Have a great rest of the week. And as we talk this week a little bit more about how we deal with this issue and other issues that are much more, the acceptance is a huge part of dealing with loss. And one of the things that gets in the way can be doubling down. Let's not do it.